Oh, gee, am I? Yeah, oh, yes. Uh, Hello, nice to see so many of you. This gives the lie to one of my recent editorials where I said that the number of people attending in-person events seems still to be down, but it's good to see you all. I seem to be wheeled out as the looking back person, probably because I'm so old. I did a presentation some years ago on, I think it was 25 years of CDXC, um, which went down quite well. That was when we were at wherever it was up in Cambridgeshire. And I seem to remember a photograph of Justin with curly hair. So you're spared that today. Chris seemed to think that because I happen to edit a magazine, no names, other magazines are available, all of that, that I might know something about publications through the ages. I'm not sure that's true, but I've tried to put something together, a little bit of nostalgia. He's given me a suitably enigmatic title. This could include books, magazines, newsletters, you name it, globally. In fact, Don BJ was asking me earlier whether I was going to cover some of the fascinating magazines from places like New Zealand and Australia. I'm afraid the answer is no, just because I've got to make this manageable. My sources for this, I'm sorry. I'm under strict instructions from John as to where I'm allowed to stand, so those standing versus, thank you for that. My sources, as I say, I don't know everything, believe it or not, despite my great age. Wikipedia and very much the World Radio History website, which a lot of you will be familiar with. They scan and post on their website a lot of old magazines, not just amateur radio, broadcast radio, all sorts of things, anything to do with radio history in the broadest sense. But they don't have certain magazines on there. For example, they don't have the RSGB Bulletin, or RAGCOM as it now is, and they don't have CQ magazine. That is because if a magazine says we don't like the fact that you're ripping off our copyright, then they will take it down. Practical Wireless, our publishers are well aware that the magazine is on here, but have accepted that despite the fact that we do hold copyright on all our magazines. I say all, I mean Practical Wireless and Shortwave Magazine in particular, which are still under our umbrella. So, let's start on the other side of the pond. 1915, the first QST. Remember that date because the RSGB started earlier than that. Price 10 cents and published at the expense of Hiram Percy Maxim and Charles Tusker. So they actually funded the first issues themselves, with the object of helping maintain the organization of the ARRL and to keep the amateur wireless operators of the country in constant touch with each other. But they then say, with an eye to keeping this going, every amateur will help himself and his fellows by sending in 25 cents for a 3-month trial subscription. So you weren't going to get it free forever, that was for sure. So, I mean, a lot of you will remember QST from the 50s and 60s and so on. Of course, it's still going strong. Here it is, the very latest issue. I look at them with envy. Masses of advertisements helping to cover the costs. When I visited ARRL some years ago when Dave Sumner was still the general manager and he very kindly gave me a personal tour, I met the editor of QST, had a nice chat with him, and I saw the page proofs of the latest issue all along the wall, and they said, oh, all the stuff, check those before it goes out. About 12 staff working on the magazine. I said, I don't need to do that. All our staff check the page proofs of PW before they go out. That's me. ARRL have acquired some other publications along the way, in particular QEX, which is a very excellent technical publication, and I understand the title, maybe, and maybe the editorial and very little else. You know, it's very good, but quite technical. However, I'm much more interested in NCJ, and I took it for a number of years. It was founded in the 70s by some W0 hams, and they duplicated it and sent it out, but eventually it all became too much and was taken over by the ARRL. Unfortunately, in my view at least, it's become very much US-centric. It has results of some of the more obscure US contests in it. But having said that, the latest issue has an article about our very own Bob GU4YOX. So it's got to be good. But many of you will remember 73 with fondness. That was first issued in 1960, and the last one was in 2003, so it kept going for 43 years. And of course, it was founded, as many of you will remember, by W2NSD, Wayne Green, Never Say Die, NSD. He first published a magazine about amateur radio, apparently, in 1952, and that was about teletype. And then later became editor of CQ, but then branched out on his own. He was quite the businessman. He was instrumental in founding Byte magazine and a number of other computer magazines. Many of you will remember Byte. It was a very, very successful magazine in the early days of the personal computer. And Wayne was probably best known for his editorials, which were always controversial, shall we say, and he was never one to spare his verbiage when he was talking about the ARRL. He was not one to let them off the hook at all. And the other magazine that you'll remember, and in fact is still going, surprisingly in some ways, is CQ, which was first published in 1945, and also has a Spanish language edition. And what I didn't realize is between 95 and 2000, there was a French language version as well. And I guess, it's known internationally because of its awards and its contests. And that was what gave it a boost to its circulation, undoubtedly. But in recent years, the contests have gone under the umbrella of the Worldwide Radio Operators Foundation, WWROF, which is independent. And I just wonder what's happened to the circulation of CQ magazine as a result of that. They've also had some hiccups in terms of the way they circulate the magazine and so on. It was actually suggested to me some years ago by an American friend that PW Publishing might like to buy CQ because they could make a better job of it than the publishers in the States. We decided not to do that. I also have some issues with CQ. I remember a piece of equipment I reviewed, a new transceiver, in fact, some years ago, where, which I was reviewing, I can't remember, probably for Ham Radio Today at the time. And I found some problems with this particular radio. And CQ reviewed the same radio about the same time and didn't find any problems at all. In fact, I am absolutely convinced that they never took it out of the box. The whole review was written, and could have been written very easily from the manual, and I suspect it was. However, fair play to them, they are one that's still going. Because there have been many others over the years, and I've just picked a selection here, but if you look on the World Radio History website, you'll see that there are a lot of amateur radio publications that have come and gone in the States. Ham Radio Horizon, some of you will remember. VHF Comms, definitely you'll remember. Ham Radio Magazine. Popular Communications was popular in the States. And there are others. I found this one called Ham Brew, which apparently ran from 93 to 97. I don't remember, but presumably if you were an American amateur, you would have been familiar with it. But VHF comms from 69 to as recently as 2013, Popular Communications died in 2013. There's a theme here. A lot of these magazines started in the 70s and 80s, and really on the back, I guess, of CB. Certainly that's what happened in the UK, as I'll be saying. Because if we look at the UK pages on the World Radio History website, there's quite a lot there. Early technology, they call this, up to 1945. You've got Popular Wireless, Modern Wireless, Radio Review, Harmsworth's Wireless Encyclopedia, Practical Radio, and so on. Lots of them. And post-World War II, plenty more. Not all amateur radio, again, but a lot of hobby electronics magazines. I see Maplin Electronics had a magazine at one time. And of course, you've got Practical Television, which spun off from Practical Wireless and others. Really quite a selection. So let's just talk about a few of them. Shortwave Mag. Yes. Nods from the audience. First issue was in 35, but then it was relaunched in March 37. And a lot of us remember, I look at the green issue here, a lot of us remember that format of the magazine from the 60s and 70s. And it really was an amateur radio magazine, whereas Practical Wireless back then covered a whole range of electronics. It eventually became shortwave, well, SWM and Scanning Scene, edited by Kevin Nice, and indeed featuring Mike Richards, who's already been mentioned today and who writes a data modes column for PW to this day, as a decode author. And as far as I can tell, it was last seen in 2005. But what many of us remember, quite apart from its coverage of amateur radio, and some of you may have even written into the HF column back in the day. There were certainly some familiar call signs there. I remember somebody called Steve Telenius Lowe, who had who was a shortwave listener back then and wrote in occasionally, and so on. But we remember Austin Forsyth, G6FO, who was obviously out of the same genetic stock as Wayne Green, because he was also quite a controversial editor, arguing against all sorts of things, not least in this particular June 67 issue against Britain joining a common market. So he'd have no doubt been pleased at where we are these days. Radioactive magazine was started by our good friend Mike, G3SED, on the back of the CB boom. He wasn't happy with the publicity he was getting for his CB business and decided to start his own magazine. Chris, you just put me right if I'm wrong on any of this, but he found, as the RSGB did later with Ham Radio Today, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, that trying to run a single magazine and get it out is quite a challenge. The W.H. Smiths of this world are not interested in a publisher who only has one magazine. So eventually it became part of a group called PW Publishing, which I'll talk about more in a moment, and metamorphosed into Radio User, which incorporated Radioactive and a magazine that PW Publishing already had called Shortwave Mag. Sadly, Radio User folded very recently in December 2022, just a few months ago, and is now, up to a point, absorbed into Practical Wireless. And the one that got me started as a national author was Amateur Radio Magazine. It arrived late 82 on the back of the CB boom I've mentioned earlier. and was produced initially as an occasional informative booklet. There were 3 issues, but by April '83 they realized there was scope for a monthly magazine, an independent monthly magazine, even though others already existed. At that time, just as a little anecdote, Martin G3ZAY and myself had started editing the RSGB's weekly DX news sheet. We'd taken that over from Jeff Watts. We were putting it together each week, and the RSGB was handling the subscription side. And I was not impressed with the HF column in Amateur Radio magazine, so I wrote to the editor and said, look, clearly this guy isn't in touch. He doesn't see the weekly DX news sheet. Maybe he should take out a subscription. And the editor instead, of course, said, well, if you know so much about it, why don't you write the column? And that's what happened. And I've been writing for one magazine or another literally every month since then, 40 years. And I later started writing a packet radio column for the same magazine when the PK232 and the like came on the scene. Again, many of you will remember those halcyon days. I gather AX25 is on the way back, but there you go. And the other one, again, that was started in '83 was Ham Radio Today. Yes. That for a long time was edited supposedly by a lady called Sheila Lorek. It was actually edited by Chris Lorek, her husband, but he was working for SMC at the time, so it was convenient to claim his wife as the editor. And the aforementioned Steve, G4JVG, as he then was HF columnist for several years. By this time he'd got his amateur radio license and was making his mark as a bit of a DXer. But he moved to Papua New Guinea in '91, which very conveniently was when Amateur Radio magazine folded, and I just stepped straight into Steve's shoes as HF columnist, and indeed stayed with the magazine, which was eventually bought by the RSGB. They wanted an independent magazine, a newsstand magazine, and they'd always fought against making the Bulletin or Ragcom a newsstand magazine, but this was their solution. Unfortunately, they ran into exactly the same problem I mentioned with Mike and Radioactive, which is if you have one title, you don't have much clout, you can't do much. So eventually that was wound up. We'll come back to it in a moment, but let me talk about one or two others, because Wireless World is one I remember with great fondness, and I'm sure many of you do. It started as the Marconi Graph in 1911, absorbed into something called the Radio Review. Publishers also offered Experimental Wireless and the Wireless Engineer. It became Electronics and Wireless World in '83, Electronics World and Wireless World, and finally Electronics World in '96, and is still in publication. But if we go back to the halcyon days, as well as covering all sorts of other matters, it did cover amateur radio. It had a World of Amateur Radio column on a monthly basis, but I also remember, for example, a very elaborate receiver designed for the amateur bands with umpteen valves and all the rest of it. Way out of my constructional abilities back then, but it was absolutely fascinating to read. And although it's not an amateur radio magazine, I am sure that many of you will remember Radio Constructor with fondness, with Smithy in his workshop, and nods from the assembled company. And that ran from 47 to 81. And I have some bound volumes, annual volumes, which I enjoy looking back at. In fact, I think I actually asked for a bound volume as a school prize on one occasion, which raised a few eyebrows. They expected you to go for Shakespeare or something like that. It became Radio and Electronics Constructor in '72, and the basis of a new magazine, Radio and Electronics World, in '81. And finally, there's Radio and Electronics World, and finally petered out in '89. The question you may be asking yourselves is, why do these magazines no longer exist? But I'd suggest the internet has a lot to do with it. And certainly in the UK, and you've only got to look at the advertisements in some of these magazines post-war, there were clearly a lot of ex-service personnel coming back into the workforce, having worked in signals or whatever, wanting to learn a bit more about electronics, seeing the opportunities in the electronics industry, in radio and TV repair and so on, and wanting as much information as they could get. Practical wireless. Never heard it, no. So that was launched as a weekly publication in September '32 with F.J. Cam, the brother of Sidney Cam, as editor. Why do I mention Sidney Cam? Because he designed the Hurricane fighter, of course. So they were quite a talented pair of brothers. It was launched as a supplement to Hobbies magazine, but quickly became separate. I don't know how they managed weekly publication back in those days. It was quite amazing, but if you read the first issue, they'd obviously done a lot of groundwork. They already had some designs. They already had the first of what was to become their famous blueprints, which would often be published with the magazine, and you took the blueprint out and it showed you how to lay out the chassis and build a radio. In fact, I gave a talk in Staines or somewhere some years ago, and Graham G3XTZ came along with a TRF radio that he'd built, and he produced the blueprint that he'd built it from, which was quite nice. In September 1940, with the difficulty of getting paper and so on during the war, they moved temporarily to a monthly publication. Temporarily. Here we are in '23, and it's still a monthly publication. It covered audio, it covered TV until the launch of practical television in 1950, and it covered broadcast radio as well as amateur radio. But many of you will remember the constructional projects by the great F.G. Rayer. I mean, he wrote for science fiction magazines, he wrote for a number of local newspapers, and still he was prodigious in his output of 80 and 40 meter transmitters and the like. We always wondered whether he took them apart and reused the parts, or whether these things still exist in a box somewhere. Incidentally, shows how little I knew. The first magazine I bought, because I knew nothing about amateur radio, I thought he was G30 GR, but there you are. PW became part of the Practical Group after leaving IPC publications. So IPC had this Practical Group, Practical Woodworker, Practical Motorist, Practical Wireless, Practical this, Practical that. And they were moved from London to Bournemouth as a block for the very good business reason that one of the directors of IPC lived in Bournemouth, and it was quite convenient. But eventually they kind of fizzled out, and there was a management buyout by a number of people, including one Elaine Richards, of Practical Wireless Shortwave magazine. And funnily enough, part of the stable was a magazine called Falconers, which was a quarterly magazine about, guess what, birds of prey. So, a bit of a mix, but there you go. And they became PW Publishing. And PW Publishing was acquired by Warner's Group in 2017, and that has subsequently opened the way for new channels to market. Warner's distribute about 120 titles, many of which are their own, and they've got some big sellers. They've got a birdwatching magazine, they've got caravanning magazines and so on. So they've got a lot more clout with W.H. Smiths and the like. So we're still going. We celebrated 90th anniversary last year. I ran a GB90 PW for the month of September, and hopefully we'll still be going in 2032. Not with me as an editor, I suspect. Wanted to mention one or two other UK publications. Here's one. I mentioned a number in my editorial the other month, and somebody said, oh, you didn't mention Radio Bygones, so I need to put that right. Jeff Arnold was an editor of PW, but then decided he was going to go off and do his own thing, and started this magazine, which ran from 89 to 2017. And it wasn't about amateur radio as such, it was about old radios, 1154, 1155, of course, and so on. But very popular among the radio fraternity, and beautifully produced, I have to say. Anyway, let's talk about the RSGB, who I gather publish a magazine on a monthly basis. So Chris, you keep looking at me. Yeah. Just be careful what you say to them. It was founded in 1913 as the London Wireless Club, and they produced the T&R Bulletin. And indeed, Don was saying to me earlier, you can get these on CD and look through, and they're absolutely fascinating. They've gradually been working back through the years and making the old issues available. It later became the RSGB Bulletin, which is how I remember it, and then became Radcom. And these days, of course, they also produce Radcom Basics for the beginners, and Radcom Plus, which has additional material to what's in Radcom. But then they have the advantage of having a slightly bigger editorial team than I do. Oh! Well, I see they're looking for a technical editor again, so he didn't last long, but anyway. What has happened to all the magazines? Well, one answer would be a lot of this stuff is now available on the internet. Why do people need a magazine anymore? Another would be, well, you know, we're a bunch of old farts and nobody new is coming into the hobby. Though the circulation of PW certainly went up during lockdown as more people did come into the hobby or back into the hobby. But I think another reason is that there are so many facets to the hobby these days that people will buy a magazine and say, well, I'm only interested in X. Well, the answer to that is that they then join a club that deals with X. I mean, there's one here, CDXC. I don't know what they do, but they obviously, you know, one of the things they clearly do is publish quite a nice magazine. But no, I mean, you know, seriously, you've got the 6 Meter Group who produce an excellent magazine. Signal, which is from the VMARS, the Vintage and Military Amateur Radio Society, is absolutely wonderful. It's very, very well put together. You've got a couple of CW clubs here, Keynote for the FIS CW and the Focus, which is the First Class CW Operators Club. And then you've got CQTV, British Amateur TV Club. You've got Sprat, very popular, beautifully produced. They get some wonderful constructional articles, which I don't seem to be able to get hold of for PW. And it's edited, funnily enough, these days by Tex, G1TEX, who was our technical editor on Practical Wireless until he retired. And there are others, Rails and Radio for the British Railways Amateur Radio Society. I mean, there's loads of them. So, you know, magazines are not dead, but kind of specialist. Some of them are published only online, but most of those are published in paper form still. So I just wanted to mention one or two other European publications, which I think are deserving of a mention, and then I'd be interested to know which you think I've managed to miss out. I wish my German was better, because Funk Amateur, which is an independent magazine in Germany, is absolutely brilliant. And I would say that because we've had 2 or 3 of our expedition write-ups published in it. But no, they have some very good technical articles, and it's still going strong. And I wanted to mention Dubus, or however you're supposed to pronounce it, because this is a specialist VHF magazine, or as it says here, an international amateur radio magazine intended for the serious VHF and up operator. I don't know what its circulation is, but it's still going. It's published in German and English, 4 issues a year of over 100 A5 pages, devoted to a mix of state-of-the-art technical articles and DX operating news. And the editorial team includes our good friend Ian, GM3SEK, a very clever guy. And guess what? Michael Kuhner, DB6NT. You all have heard of the Kuhner transverters and so on. So these are people who know what they're talking about and produce an excellent magazine. This is the one from February of this year. And in Japan, they still sustain an independent magazine, CQ Ham Radio, and if anybody's seen it, it's massive. It has a circulation apparently of about 55,000, edited by JP1NWZ, and was first published back in '46. So they're quite quickly off the mark after the war. I picked this particular page because it's got the write-up of me operating from C56 last year. Not that I can understand a word of it, but I have to assume they did a reasonable translation of whatever I sent them. But that's just the low-band DXing column. And obviously they have a high-band column, they have VHF columns, they have reviews, they have all sorts. It really is quite a good magazine, or I think it is, as I don't read Japanese. So I'm not going to try and cover any more, but I would be very interested to know what you think I've omitted that's worth a mention.
Yeah. Oh, one at the back. No.
No, you have to use the microphone.
Will do.
Or our audio man will get very cross.
I was going to say a solid copy for CW Ops. I think FOC's also got a newsletter as well.
The CW Ops magazine is very good. It's only published electronically, I think I'm right in saying. Yeah, I mean, that's a good one. That's another example where a club produces an excellent magazine. And incidentally, you've just reminded me, Americans are much better at writing material and sharing it than the Brits are, unfortunately. We need to learn some lessons. I am a member of CW Ops. Mike, Chris, IUF.
Sorry, going to go long path.
There's the monitor by the International Shortwave League. That's been going since 1954, I think. That's for shortwave listeners only, of course.
Yeah, International Shortwave League, you're quite right. And I tried to find a decent image of Monitor, a recent image, and I couldn't find one on the internet. I belonged to the ISWL before I belonged to the RSGB, and in fact, and I haven't mentioned it, but I did actually write a column for Monitor, if you go back to the late 60s. In fact, I didn't even join, that must have been before I even belonged to the RSGB, because ISWL ran their own QSL bureau, and I didn't get many QSLs, and I wondered why. And then when I sent an envelope to the RSGB bureau, I got a whole pile. I thought they would all have found their way via the but yes, you're right, Monitor. But I'm out of touch these days with the... Thank you. Just ask. Yes.
Yeah, he'll let her have one.
Thank you. Don, how do you see the balance going between paper magazines and purely electronic publishing? Because obviously in CDXC we have both, and there will become a point where it no longer becomes worth producing paper ones.
Yeah, I have argued, because GMDX has gone, as we know, totally electronic, and a number of other organizations have. I value the paper magazine from CDXC, and I would like it to keep going. I said that since Warner's took over PW, they've been able to make an electronic version available. Justin is going to be able to see that, as he's just won a year's subscription. Justin grimacing at the front row. It's available through Pocket Mags. It's available in the various library. A lot of libraries have magazines available online. These are things that Warner's could do that PW Publishing couldn't do, because they didn't have the resources. But Warner's could do it automatically, because they do it with most of their magazines. The result is we've picked up a lot of electronic subscriptions. The good thing is we've picked up a lot of overseas electronic subscriptions from countries that no longer have an independent amateur radio magazine. Why did we not have paper subscriptions overseas? Because the cost of postage makes the subscription quite, far too high. Whether paper magazines will stay is an interesting question, but the demand for the paper version of Practical Wireless is still holding up. It's doing very well. So I don't know. I mean, Ragcom thinking of doing getting rid of the paper version? I doubt it. Yes. But it is getting more difficult. And one of the things that's driving, that's a problem, a number of ads in shortwave in Practical Wireless has dropped significantly in recent years. Not because our reader base has dropped or anything, but a lot of the retailers are thinking, why should we pay for advertisements when they can just come and look online? I did a review when I took over the magazine, and one of the things that the readers said they liked to look at in the magazine was the ads, but the vendors don't necessarily agree. And Moonraker have dropped from 4 pages a month in PW to 1 page, which simply says, go to our online site. In fact, at Newark last year, they had no radios on their stand at all. All they had was a computer taking online orders. But if you lose your advertising, you lose one of your revenue streams, and it makes it more difficult. And I have to say, the cost of paper has just gone through the roof in the last year, mainly because a lot of the pulp was coming from the Ukraine. And you can't just replace that overnight. So I think the jury is out. I hope, as I spend most of my time sitting in front of a screen, I actually like to pick up a paper magazine, but I realize the younger generation don't necessarily want to do that.
I'm conscious of the time, actually, because we have to be out of the room at 5:30, and
my apologies, Chris.
No, it's not that. And obviously we've got one more presentation. I want to give them time. So Don, thanks very much.